I've got them here anyway.
Good evening, everyone. My name is May Murphy. I'm the archivist here in the college. I'd like to welcome you to the Royal College of Surgeons today. I'm also curator of the exhibition that's upstairs. Now, some of you, I think, got to get a view of it, but if you didn't, please do come back. It's going to be on open, free to the public until the 17th of April. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening, and I'm delighted to do so. Our speaker, he's an author, he's a journalist, he's a well-known historian. He has held positions such as former editor of The Irish People. He was also former community affairs correspondent and industry correspondent for the Irish Times. He's written numerous books, including The Lockout, Dublin 1913, A City in Wartime, Dublin 1914 to 1918, A City in Turmoil, Dublin 1919 to 1921, and A City in Civil War, Dublin 1919 to 1921. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to your speaker, Padraig Yeates.
Thanks, Maeve. I think I've sort of drawn the short straw in a way, in that I have to explain what was good about the British Empire and what the Brits did for us. And in fact, they did quite a lot for us, or they tried to do a lot for us, but often they A, didn't make a very good job of it, and B, we didn't want what they had to offer. But I've called it deliberately Serving the Crown and the Half Crown, because most of my family would have been servants of the Half Crown. My father would have been in the British Army, my grandfather would have been in the British Army, had an uncle in the RAF, I had cousins in the British Army. I was probably the first person, male, in my family for a couple of generations at least, who wasn't in the British Army, because there was full employment by the time I grew up. You could get a job other than that. So that's where the term comes from. It was very common in Dublin, working class areas. A lot of working class Dubliners served in the British Army, and they're often referred to jokingly as servants of the crown, of a half crown rather than the crown. So that's to explain it. But to return to from there to the next step, the person there, some of you I'm sure will recognise me, is David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George probably had more impact on Ireland than any other individual in the 20th century. And he's mainly remembered now for people like the men on his left, on your right, who were auxiliaries guarding the Mansion House. He was the man who sent over the Black and Tans, which was not one of his better ideas, but it's probably the thing he's most remembered for in Ireland. But I want to talk about other aspects of his career instead. He was also the man who gave us the old age pension. And as a pensioner myself, I'm very appreciative of the fact, because that transformed life in this city. And so my perspective on all this sends me from working class, and particularly unskilled and semi-skilled working class families, rather than nationalists or unionists or anybody else. It was very important because up until the old age pension, 90% of working class Dubliners died in the poorhouse if they lived long enough. So it was very, very important. And I looked at the figures in the South Dublin Union. It took a while to kick in, obviously. The Act was passed in 1908. It didn't really come in for 2 years after that. You might be interested to know that although the Irish formed only 9%, and I'm counting North and South now, although the Irish only made up 9% of the population of the United Kingdom, they made up 27% of old age pensioners. So people in Ireland are obviously 3 times more likely to live long enough to get a pension than if you lived in England, Scotland and Wales. But there is another explanation for this, as you've probably guessed, and that is Lloyd George brought in the old age pension at 70, and we're probably heading back that way again. But he came in at 70, and he did that because the average life expectancy in the United Kingdom was 70. So he knew he wouldn't have to pay it to too many people. But the other reason why it was important in Ireland is that although it was brought in at 70 partly because they could use the 1841 census, which was the first census, gave you an accurate picture of the population, so you could calculate how many people were 70. In Ireland, the census didn't really get underway until after the famine. And I don't know if any of you have looked on the 1911 census at your own ancestors, but I think if you do, certainly in Dublin, you will find that quite a lot of people aged quite dramatically between the 1901 census and the 1911 census. The only exception I could find are some middle-class women who actually got younger. But most people actually aged dramatically between 1901 and 1911. So you had all these people who were basically claiming a pension, and the Brits couldn't do anything about it, really. Well, they could. Eventually they said, no, we can't have any more Irish pensioners. So you had the unfortunate situation where some people over 70 couldn't get a pension because someone who was under 70 already had claimed a quota, and until that person died, they were left out, hanging out to dry. But it was important, as I think you can see there in the second bullet point, 40% of Dubliners in sorry, that figure is wrong. It should say there was a 40% drop in the number of Dubliners who died in the workhouse. And there was a third drop in those who, in the number of inmates in the workhouse. So the number of aged and infirm was dropping dramatically in the two Dublin workhouses between the start of the First World War and the end of the First World War. In fact, the numbers fell so much that when the British Army decided to occupy the North Dublin Union on North Brunswick Street, there was enough room left in the South Dublin Union, in spite of 1916, to move everybody over there. There was room for everybody. The population of the two workhouses had fallen so dramatically. And I'm saying this just to point out what a huge impact the old age pension had on the living conditions of working class people in Dublin. And then in 1911, you had the introduction of unemployment and health benefits in Britain. You had to be working to contribute, and you had to contribute to get a pension, or to get an unemployment benefit, or to get health cover. But these were nevertheless very important steps. How was it funded? Well, again, it's hard to believe now, but the Liberal government was facing huge social unrest. We had the suffragettes looking for a vote, and many of these women were members of the political elite. They were a middle class. They weren't all destitute beggars by any means. So there was huge pressure on the government on women's votes. There was even greater pressure for industrial unrest. Between 1910 and the outbreak of the First World War, the number of people on strike rose very dramatically from about 600,000 into the millions. Huge unrest. And one of the ways they were trying to deal with this was by introducing all these social benefits, which were based on the German model. So how do you fund all this? Well, you fund it through budgets. You fund it with death duties and land tax. I think it's hard for us to understand now, but the landed aristocracy in Britain were a very, very powerful and influential group within society. And yet somehow Lloyd George managed to manoeuvre these taxes through Parliament. And the same with income tax. Income tax was raised. There was a super tax introduced for people earning over 3,000. Increased tax on drink and tobacco. Tax on drink didn't go down well in Ireland because we were so dependent on the drinks industry. But all these things were done to fund this. But not everyone was happy. So eventually what happened was there was a crisis. The House of Lords said, no, we're not going to be taxed out of existence. We're not going to have to pay all these taxes to subsidise all these lazy, poor people. We're not going to pay for old age pensions and so on. So there was a very, very fierce battle over it. There was a constitutional crisis. That constitutional crisis led to the Liberals actually losing their majority in the House of Commons in 1910. And there were two consequences of that. One was that the Liberal government became dependent on the Irish Party for support to stay in power. And the other was that the House of Lords lost their permanent veto on Home Rule for Ireland. Everyone knew it didn't matter how many Home Rule bills were passed in the House of Commons, they'd all be shot down in the House of Lords. That situation had now changed. The possibility of Home Rule came into existence, and that's what really set the Irish crisis going. But it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the earlier battle over social welfare, primarily in Britain, but also affecting us. Ulster said no, and the Irish Volunteers were set up in response to that. Ulster says no. Why did Ulster say no? Well, in 1910, thanks to the old age pension, Ireland went, for the first time since the Act of Union, from being a net contributor to the British Exchequer, in other words, the British government making more out of Ireland than they have to pay to keep the show on the road, into a net recipient. And by 1912, as you can see, the amount of money that the British were spending in Ireland was 2 million more than they were taking in. 2 million was quite a lot of money in those days. Now, I should point out and you'll see an asterisk there, when the First World War broke out, the Irish were paying more tax, so more money was being taken out of Ireland. But the same was true of the whole UK because they're fighting a major war. But before the First World War broke out, Ireland was a net recipient. And the Unionists feared this because the Unionists were actually paying their way, if you like. because it was a highly industrialised and very prosperous part, the only prosperous part really of the island. So you can understand to some extent, I think, why Ulster Unionists were afraid of being part of a Home Rule Ireland, which would be dominated by the nationalists. Again, I'm coming back to Dublin. Sorry, people from outside Dublin, but the rising happened in Dublin too. Those figures, I think they're self-explanatory, but they show the poverty, if you like, of Dublin. 37% of all committos to Irish reformatories were from Dublin, even though it only had 7% of the population. 21% were from Belfast, although it had 10.5% of the population. You see, 82% of girls committed and 63% of boys were committed for offences due to hunger, mainly larceny, but it was anything from stealing sweets to housebreaking and a whole range of other things. And paupers, I think this is one of the telling phrases. In those days, they had a pauperisation rate in the United Kingdom. So for every they counted how many paupers there were for every 10,000 of the population. And the average for the United Kingdom, as you can see there, was 125. The figure for Dublin was 272. And whereas in Belfast, it was only 69. So whether it was just the Belfast people who were stingier, I don't know. But I suspect it was because it was a higher standard of living, and there was more occupations who actually have a job and a decent job than there was here. The picture, by the way, was taken in late 1913. It shows youngsters outside Liberty Hall on Beresford Place. You can see the railway bridge behind them, marching in support probably of their fathers who were locked out in the lockout. Again, looking at servants of the Crown and half-crown, people reacted to the Home Rule crisis in different ways. But we have this image, there's been this very soft image being projected of Redmond as a very reasonable, very generous-hearted, which he was, man politically, and really he could have delivered a lot for Ireland if he'd only been given a chance. But I mean, his record doesn't reflect that. They were very good at fighting for the land of Ireland, for the farmers of Ireland. They were quite good at getting agricultural labourers' cottages as well, which were tied usually to the farm. So it was a mixed blessing. But go outside that and you're dealing with a very, very reactionary group of people. And I just quote one example. Twice British governments tried to introduce or tried to extend the factory inspectorate to religious institutions, and twice John Redmond and his brother Willie Redmond shot it down in the House of Commons. And they said, how dare anyone suggest that Catholic religious bodies would be anything other than extremely caring for anyone in their charge. We could have had factory inspectors and Magdalen laundries in this country in 1905 if it hadn't been for John Redmond and the Irish Party. William Martin Murphy led the charge on health benefits. He said he could afford to pay the extra money involved, but he gave evidence to a parliamentary committee that was sent over here and held interviews with people all over the island, in which he actually gave evidence to say that he could assure them that anyone in Dublin, and he was referring specifically to Dublin, who needed hospital treatment or medical attention of any sort, who couldn't afford to pay for it, would get it anyway, free of charge. And he said this under oath, as far as I can remember. So what does this mean? Because again, we're coming down now to the halfpennies, not half-crowns anymore, but halfpennies. Well, if you look at England, if you're a man working in England, you pay 4p a week to get unemployment benefit and health benefit. If you're a woman, you paid 3p a week. An employer also paid 3p a week, and the government contributed 2p a week. And in return for that, if you're unemployed, you got, it wasn't a huge amount, you got, I think it was 7 or 6 a week for a period of time, and hopefully you got a job. If you didn't, the benefit would eventually run out. It wasn't like the modern dole, but it was the makings of a modern welfare state. In Ireland, men paid only 3p a week. Women only paid 2p a week. And you see over 16, anyone over the age of 16 was considered an adult. In fact, anyone over the age of 14 who committed a crime was considered an adult. Employers paid 2.5p a week. And I say, William Martin Murphy said, look, I can afford to pay an extra 8p a week, but it's really unnecessary. And the state paid 2p a week. What was that difference for? It wasn't unemployment benefit. The unemployment benefit was already in. But by now, John Redmond and co. had the whip hand. So they said, look, we've had enough of your extravagant socialist nonsense to Lloyd George. We wanted to stop because when we get home rule, we can't afford all these luxuries. So they said, we don't health benefits, you can keep them. So when they came to Ireland, GPs in Britain were accepting 7 shillings capitation fee per patient they had on this system for the working poor, basically. generally. In Ireland, the GPs in Belfast said they wanted 8 and 6 months a week, and the British government said, okay, we can manage that. Come to Dublin, GPs in Dublin wanted 21 shillings a week. They wanted it because they knew they wouldn't get it. It was a ridiculous amount, but everybody could walk. And Lloyd George was saying, well, you know, we don't want to force the Irish. If the Irish don't want health benefits, we're not going to get ourselves into trouble forcing it down their throats. So that's basically what happened. And it was really a war over the foundations of a welfare state. And who wanted a welfare state? Well, the trade unions wanted a welfare state. Funnily enough, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, who we think of as a very reactionary organisation, which they were in many respects, wanted a welfare state because they were health benefits. They were a providential society. They wanted members. They wanted people to join. In fact, Jim Larkin used to regularly denounce the Ancient Order of Hibernians. When it came to unemployment benefit, he used to put the Transport Union funds in with the Hibernian because he couldn't be bothered setting up a scheme of his own. But Lloyd George was trying to get people to buy into the system, so he could do it through the state, you could do it through a trade union, you could do it through a friendly society, you could do it through all sorts of means. He was trying to get people to buy into this newfangled system. But who was opposed to it? Well, you can see the list for yourself. The Irish Party, the farmers, property owners, because they were taxpayers and ratepayers. They'd have to fund it. Employers, of course, didn't want it. Another halfpenny a week on the cost of every employee. Medical profession didn't want it. There were exceptions. There were some honourable exceptions, but institutionally, the medical profession didn't want it. Voluntary hospitals didn't want it. I looked in Dublin. 2/3 of all the voluntary hospitals in Dublin received no state funding. Catholic Church didn't want it. You allow the state in, funding something, the next thing you know, they'll be coming back saying, can we have a look at how you're doing things? So they didn't want it. They were all dependent on private medicine. And for that reason, they didn't want this newfangled idea. And anyone who was that poor could go to the House of Industries hospitals across the river, where Sir Thomas Miles, amongst other people, gave their services at a very low rate. And they were funded by British House of Commons anyway, and by private donation. So that was the system that we had. So we're talking about two different visions of the future. One was Irish, wanted to go one particular route. One was British, wanted to go another route. So life and death in Dublin. I think you can read those figures, but the only thing I'd say by way of explanation very quickly is that you can see there's two areas, the metropolitan area and the municipal area. Municipal area was the city within the canals, more or less, with slight extensions outside. The metropolitan area is the whole city and county. And you can see there's a significant difference in the death rate between the two. What I find interesting, though, about those figures is that if you look at the First World War, they come up very sharply at the beginning of the First World War to 29.5 per thousand in the metropolitan area in the first quarter of 1915, and 31.4 in the first quarter of 1915 as well. But looking at those figures, no one's explained why they rose so sharply. My own feeling is that Britain hadn't been involved in a major war since Napoleon, and they were mobilising hundreds of thousands of men. They were putting in place supports for those men, but it took a long time. And a lot of men were joining the British Army or Navy, but mainly the Army. Their families were becoming dependent on separation allowances, but it took a while for that system to kick in. So a lot of people who in Dublin who were in the Army, their wife or their mother or their sister or whatever at home wasn't getting the money that was supposed to come through. But I don't know, I'm just speculating. But if you look after that, right until you reach the influenza epidemic, which began, or pandemic, in 1918, the third quarter of 1918, the mortality rates fall for the city and the county. Why did they fall? Because standards of living were increasing. That being said, those figures actually mask very severe discrepancies. Sorry, these are the only figures I could get at a bit of a rush. Sorry, it's been a bit hectic the last couple of weeks, but I just took infectious disease and I compare Kingstown with Dublin City. And if you look at those, you can see there were the total number of infectious diseases reported in Kingstown was 39 for that quarter, for the whole year, the whole year of 1916. For the first quarter, should be 16, there were 746 in Dublin City, of which 418 were TB of the lungs. So that shows you the real difference between life in the city and life in the suburbs. And that had financial implications as well, because if you lived in Kingstown or Blackrock, you paid about maybe 1 or 3pence, 1 or 6pence in the pound for the poor rate, to keep the poor in the area, because there weren't that many poor and there weren't that many sick. If you lived in South City Dublin, you paid 2 and 11 pence in the pound. If you lived north side of the city, you paid 3 and 3 pence in the pound. So, living in a healthier area was actually very beneficial, not just from the point of view of not contracting all these nasty diseases, but it didn't actually cost you enough, as much to look after the poor either. These were all local politics. These were all important, though, when it came to municipal elections and who stood for what. So getting back to the families then, these figures are fairly well known now. As I said, separation allowances. A lot of men joined the British Army because if you joined the British Army and you had a clean record and you came out with honourable discharge, it was generally felt that was a plus in Dublin because most employers were Protestant and their religion and unionists in their politics. So if you're a soldier, all things being equal, you've been in the army, good record, the other guy hasn't been in the army, he could be a Fenian or he certainly wasn't very loyal because he was a Catholic, so he gave the job to the ex-soldier. Also, the other advantage is the disposable income for most working class Dubliners, when they paid for basic things like food and rent and so on, was about 3 shillings a week. If you were lucky, maybe 5 shillings a week. A reservist got 7 shillings a week on top of that. Now, in return for that, you had to do 2 weeks service training but most Dubliners were unskilled workers. So when you join the army, you become unskilled in the army. You're in the infantry. And the British government isn't going to waste money giving you 2 weeks holiday down in Fermoy or something once a year. They just leave you there. If you're in the engineers or signals or something, then you would go back for refresher training. So all these men were getting 7 shillings a week basically for doing nothing. There was just the vague possibility if there was ever a war, they don't have to go back and join the army, and everybody knew there wasn't going to be a war. So that's why you had so many Dublin working class people joining the British Army. When the war broke out, of course, they had to go back. They didn't have a choice. And one of the things that amazes me about James Connolly is the way he condemned members of his own union who rejoined the British Army who were reservists. They had 2 choices. They could go back and join the army, or the police could come and arrest them, take them to Colchester or some other military establishment, some other prison, and keep them there for a month or so and then send them back to the army. So it's one of those mysterious things. But anyway, if you're a widow, if you were lucky enough to have the biggest mouth in the house taken away from you, and he was fed and lodged by the British Army, and you got 12 and 6 for yourself, and you got 2 and 6 for every child. The great thing about the system was if you had another baby, you got another 2 and 6. It didn't matter how hard you worked for a private sector employer, going back to him saying, my wife's just had another child, would not get you another 2 and 6 a week of a pay rise. So the British system was actually quite progressive. So women that's one of the reasons why the system was so popular. The only survey I'm aware of in Dublin is in the northeast tenements of the city, but the second biggest source of income in those tenements after labourers' wages were separation allowances. So that was a major factor. And I believe from what work I've done that the biggest transfer of wealth into the tenements of Dublin in their entire history came during the First World War to separation women. And if you look at the poverty indices, life expectancy improves, child cruelty cases fall, malnutrition cases fall. In spite of the image of separation women of spending it on drink and a good time, and I'm not saying someone didn't, there's evidence that they are from the court proceedings, but the vast majority of that money was spent on the children. And as I say, people for the first time had a decent life, and that would end very soon after independence. So that's just giving you an idea of how the war benefited Dubliners. Another way, and I'm probably rambling on a bit, I'll go very quickly, but this is important. In 1915, there was a thing called the Munitions Act. The British and the Germans were involved in this life and death struggle. So the British had this huge industrial unrest and suffrage campaign. So basically they said, look, if we win the war, women will get the vote. And if we win the war, we can go back to looking at all these problems. But in the meantime, we're going to have industrial peace. How do you have industrial peace? Well, you do it by basically saying to the employers, you cannot lock out workers. And you say to the workers, you cannot go on strike. So you have to meet, you have to negotiate. And if you can't come to an accommodation, we'll impose binding arbitration. And by and large, it worked. There are breaches of it, but by and large, it worked. And it started in the war-sensitive industries, things like munitions, railways, shipyards, that were essential to the war effort. But later on, it extended to other areas, and it provided benchmarks for other areas. And in 1917, it was extended to agriculture. And in 1917, people talk about the influence of Connolly or Larkin or syndicalism, all these things. The reality is that in October 1917, agricultural wages boards were set up, agricultural labourers saw, if I join a union, I don't have to go and see the farmer and argue and risk losing my job. I go to the union go to the Board of Trade call in the farmers and the unions, they knock heads, and if they can't agree something, they impose a pay increase on both sides. And within a year of those boards being set up, 100,000 agricultural labourers joined the Transport Union, because that was the union to join if you wanted to get a pay rise. So that's what really transformed the trade union movement here. If you look at Britain, it's similar. There were 4 million trade unionists in Britain in 1914. Beginning in 1919, there were 8 million. In Ireland, there were 100,000 trade unionists in 1914. Beginning of 1919, there were 270,000. So it made sense. It was industrial peace. I'm only going to mention this briefly because, again, it's an indicator of how things were getting better in Dublin. You can see in 1912, the last, if you like, normal year, because you had the lockout the next year, but in 1912, there were over 1,000 women prosecuted for soliciting and unruly conduct. By 1919, it had fallen to 198. And I think the reason, again, is a lot of women had an alternative. They could earn a living in the various industries, and I just go on and mention them. Again, wages of war, I think the figures speak for themselves. You look at the ads in the papers, a domestic servant or a nurse, domestic servant, £16 a year. Now you got your keep, but then you only had half a day off a week and you had no freedom. If you were a nurse and you qualified, you trained as a state enlisted nurse, you got £40 to £45 a year in the British Army. Now you got a free uniform and free lodging with it again, but £40 to £45. In 1915, to get women to work in the munitions factories, the government had to promise them at least £1 a week, and by 1917, most of them were earning £3 a week. My mother worked as a munitions worker in the Second World War, and she was a dealer in Dublin, and she earned money, beyond her wildest dreams from 1940 or 41 onwards. The basic pay is very, very low in munitions work, but the piecework rate is very good. So the more bombs you make, the more money you get. And all the only men in the factory were salaried. They were employed. They were foremen and managers and so on. They were all salaried employees. So when the air raid sirens went off, all the men scurried down to the bomb shelter because they're going to get paid at the end of the week whether the factory was there or not. And all the women would keep working, because if they didn't make showers, they'd get a pittance at the end of the week. And used to sing at the top of their voices to drown out the sound of the German bombers on the way to the Liverpool docks. And the Germans didn't know that they were making bombs for the RAF to bring back the other way. But it always struck me as one of the great examples of the sheer insanity of war. But anyway, the Easter Rising was also about morality, and there was a fear of Anglo-Saxon materialism. If you look at the sort of witness statements of volunteers and citizen army members, why they went out to fight in 1916, again and again, one of the most current themes isn't about economics or social issues, it's about Anglo-Saxon materialism killing the soul of Ireland. It was a spiritual battle. That's actually taken from Australia, but I couldn't find the Dublin one, but I believe it was the same. That woman is wearing a bodice stocking, by the way, in case anyone's wondering. But this was the sort of stuff that the Irish people were being exposed to. The censorship system broke down in the First World War because there were two censors. There was a military censor who made sure nothing appeared that was of aid, comfort to the enemy or disclosed military secrets. And the other one was the corporation censor who policed morality in the city. The trouble is that most of the shows, these risque reviews and films that were being shown, were being financed by the War Office to boost the morale of the troops. So it didn't matter if the city censor said you can't show that show because it's too risque or it's indecent. They couldn't stop soldiers going into it. So the system broke down. So that, if you like, to some extent the controls broke down. I think one of the reasons for the antipathy towards the separation of women and towards munitions workers and other people like that wasn't just their antipathy towards the Easter Rising. It was because these were young working class women who were getting above themselves. They were wearing clothes they shouldn't be wearing. They were going into places they shouldn't go to. They were having a good time, and they really had to be put in their place. And one of the few ecumenical movements that took place in Dublin in the First World War were the ladies' patrols. And under their constitution, they had to have two Catholic women and one Protestant woman. They'd be accompanied by a member of the DMP, and they would go around O'Connell Street and its byways, rooting out anyone behaving indecently. When I say anyone, I mean any woman or girl behaving indecently and sending them home. So there was a big element of social control involved in this by both nationalists and unionists. And what really outraged both groups in 1916, the British government, because they needed troops, extended separation allowances to unmarried mothers. I remember my dad telling me a story when he was about 6 years of age, he couldn't have been any older, walking along Parnell Street, and there was a barber shop in Parnell Street. I think he was there up until not that long ago. And he was just shocked. There was this man hanging from the barber's pole, naked from the waist down. And there were separation women living in the flats above the barber shop. And obviously what was happening is there was a War Office raid going on. Because if you found a woman was cohabiting or having a liaison with anyone other than her husband, she lost the allowance, she lost everything. It wasn't just a case of, getting a rap on the knuckles. So it was a big problem. So just going back quickly to Dublin City and County, the war was good for a lot of Dublin working class families. 29,000 Dubliners joined the British Army. That was the largest group anywhere on this island outside of Belfast. 5,000, almost 5,000 of them died, so it wasn't such good news for them. The widows, though, would get an increased allowance. My grandmother on my father's side was a widow. Her husband died after the war. In fact, he was invalided out in the Boer War. Won't go into details, but anyway, she got 13 and 6 a week for that, and she got 2 and 6 for each child, and she reared 3 sons on that. Interestingly, I think if you look at the city, in the metropolitan area, 9.6% of the population were in the British Army. That's a phenomenally high number. It's almost as high as conscription in Britain. But if you look at the county, it's only 2%, even though the majority of Unionists lived in the county. They didn't live in the city. Even the fatality rates were higher amongst troops in the city. And again, it comes back to the unskilled in civilian life becoming the unskilled in military life. Infantry were going to have much higher casualties. The other interesting figure which we tend to forget about is desertion. I was doing the DMP figures, which only recently have come to light. There were 835 deserters and absentees from the British Army in 1916 that we were actually apprehended by the police. We don't know how many others there were. Of those, only one was arrested begging, and only one was arrested sleeping rough. So people were looking after the others in spite of penalties. So a young girl called Mary O'Brien, for example, a weaver in the Liberties, gets 6 weeks hard labour for harbouring a deserter. We don't know who he was because he was charged and arrested separately from her. I haven't been able to link them yet. But he's either obviously a boyfriend or a relative of Mary O'Brien. Postman, whose name escapes me now, in his 50s, which was old for those days, and his wife were prosecuted for assisting their son in escaping from a military patrol in Dublin. 835 doesn't sound like a lot, but it's 1 in 5 of the intake of soldiers into the British Army in 1916 in this city. It's the equivalent of a battalion of infantry. It's quite a lot of people proportionately. So a lot of men were going over there, they'd done that, and they come back and they didn't want to do it again. The figures are pretty high around Christmas. Men came back, and I'm sure that had a big effect on recruitment. I just mentioned this. I'm young and I'm old enough. So when I was young, I grew up mainly in England. Both my mother worked in a munitions factory, my dad was in the British Army. But it was quite common when I was a small kid to see men on crutches. Wheelchairs were not very common. Men on crutches. It was also very common to see men with sleeveless coats, and they just have the empty sleeve pinned up with a safety pin. But less common, but still very, very striking, were people who were seriously facially disfigured. And I can still remember seeing the shock you got when you saw those people for the first time. This is just not by any means the worst example, but it was in the First World War that huge advances were made in cosmetic surgery on these islands as a result. That's just one picture, and you see that man had serious psychological trauma. If you look at all the soldiers who deserted, who were arrested in Dublin, before the First World War, there were relatively few soldiers arrested by the police. But after the First World War, you see them arrest things like assault, malicious damage, drunken disorderly, abusive behaviour, things which would suggest that quite a lot of them were disturbed. And it was as a result of clashes with the police that the police became aware this man is a deserter, we better take him away. So I just finished then with this 1918. Many people have forgotten this, but 1918, the only constituency in Ireland outside of Ulster to elect a Unionist MP, if we exclude Trinity, was Rathmines. And one of the key campaigners there was Anna Haslam, who had been a veteran campaigner for women's suffrage since the 1860s. She was very old in 1918. But she predicted that women would be worse off in an independent Ireland than they would be in a liberal urban democracy like Britain. And I think she was right, but I think the proof is in the pudding. I just put those, they're well-known figures. Those are women praying, I think, at Kevin Barry's funeral. But you can see in 1924, women exempted from jury service, got rid of it completely for them later in the decade. Civil service regulation orders said women can't be promoted to any senior ranks in the civil service. Divorce banned in 1925, contraception banned in 34. Conditions of Employment Act was probably the most important one because it introduced things like the marriage bar and institutionalized differential pay and conditions for women versus men. And that was backed by unions as well as employers and the Catholic Church and whatever you have in yourself. So I just finished with that, but it just gives you a slightly different view that for some people, for the urban working poor, I think they would have been better off to stay in the United Kingdom. For farmers, for shopkeepers, for businessmen, Catholic Church obviously, other interest groups, were better off with independence. But for the people I'm sort of interested in, or the perspective I've come from, it was the other way around. I was a member of the Republican movement when I was young, and for many, that was my excuse when I was young, but I was a member for a long time after that. But on reflection over the years, I think for a lot of ordinary people, the United Kingdom at that time would have been better. It only changed when we joined the European Union. When we surrendered some of our sovereignty to Europe, one of the things we had to take in return were equality directives. 1977, the first time equal pay was institutionalized in this country, because if we didn't adopt the EU directives, we'd stop getting all this money for our farmers under the Common Agricultural Policy and structural funds and so on. So that was the first time there was a significant improvement in the lot of women in this country since independence. In the first 50 years after independence, more people left this country per head of population than anywhere else in Europe. Even countries like Spain or Russia or Poland, which had massive civil war and revolution, didn't lose as many people as we did. Our people voted, including my own family, voted with their feet. So I'm just saying that things changed. Obviously, things did begin to improve, but I think only for a lot of people from the 70s. And on the other side in Britain, you had the advent of Margaret Thatcher, and British working class conditions started to fall due to that attack. So I'm not saying things are better now. What I am saying is they would have been different, that's all. But I think we do need to look at those fundamental issues to get beyond the blood and guts and who shot who, or how heroic or villainous whatever somebody did to somebody else was. So that's it, sorry. Thank you. So I hope I haven't gone on too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the lines earlier on. I hope I know Padraig made up for it with a fascinating talk. So would anyone have any questions or contributions they might like to ask? Yes, yourself.
Thank you very much. Yes. But how much would 12 and 6 be worth in today's money? And the accommodation pension, could you try to put it in today's?
It's almost impossible, because I mean, things like mobile phones or colour TVs, didn't exist. In today's money, the average industrial wage for semi-skilled, unskilled workers was about 18 shillings to 20 shillings a week. But if, say, you work for Dublin Corporation and you join the British Army, they will give you half pay. Same with Guinness's. Corporation did it because it's a public body. Guinness's did it because they actually wanted to get rid of workers. It was actually cheaper for Guinness to send a man to the front and give him half pay than to employ him. Guinness paid £77,000, which is a lot of money in those days, in the war to employees who were at the front. So if you left, say, Guinness or corporate, keep it simple, and you were earning £1 a week, which was a very reasonable wage in Dublin at that time, you were getting 10 shillings from your employer, and then your wife was getting the 12 and 6. You had to contribute to a small amount for it to get that 12 and 6, and then you're getting the money for the children as well. So it was a significant magnet, for people to join. People like Guinness and Jameson's got rid of a lot of workers because Lloyd George taxed Irish drink industry almost out of existence, because he knew he wasn't going, no matter how much Guinness you produced or how many bottles of Jameson you produced, they weren't going to help you win the war. Quite the reverse. So people were being laid off in the drinks industry, and it was actually they encouraged employees, not just out of patriotism, they're all unionist companies, but it suited the balance sheet as well to get as many men as possible off the books. And if they died, well, that was an even bigger saving. There were only, though I think, although quite a lot of Guinness men died, I think it was killed, can't remember the figure offhand, but there were only, I think, about 8 widows, of whom I think 3 remarried. And once you remarried, you lost the money. But they would have had a payment. In fairness, people like Guinness's, though, they would have gone to great lengths to re-employ men who were disabled in the war. We tend to forget that. I mean, casualty rates were huge. I mean, there were 19% average casualty rates in British Army units in the First World War, of dead, of fatalities. A lot of men came back. I was looking at some of the figures in Guinness, and loss of forearm, deafness, shell shock, lungs, TB. They take you back with almost any condition except TB, because you could infect other people. But if you got cured, they'd take you back. But they went to great lengths. What they would do is they look at how much money you had from the army, because if you lost a forearm, for example, that was worth 7 or 6 a week. So they'd look at, you couldn't do the job you did before, but they'd pay you, they try and pay you the balance between what you would have earned before minus the disability payment you got. But it was grim, and we forget that now. A lot of people came back who were not whole either in body or mind.
You were talking there about low pay. I presume that's for women. Now, didn't that last well into the foundation of our own state?
Yes.
As a matter of fact, it's professional tennis players I see
Yes.
wanted
Yeah.
to introduce it as well.
Yeah.
So, like, is there any chance at all this thing is going to be changed?
You're as good a guess at that as I'm not an expert. I simply, as I said before, that women's rights and women's earnings and place in society fell dramatically in the 20s and onwards, and didn't really begin to recover to the 70s, when we surrendered sovereignty, some of our sovereignty, to Europe. I'm not saying that was a good or bad thing. I'm simply saying it's a fact. That's what happened.
Yeah. But it is lasting into our own, well,
Yes.
into our own state, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fairness, I mean, women were low paid in the UK as well.
At this juncture, it's done away with. Or is it still
Sorry?
there?
Well, it depends on the figures. That the margins have reduced slightly, but they haven't. I think a lot depends on the area you're in and the skill levels and public service versus private sector. I'm not. I used to know. I have a lot of that stuff off the top of my head, but I'm semi-retired like yourself now at this stage, so I haven't been looking at the figures closely. But certainly from 77, the introduction of equality legislation was the first time there was a structured attempt to deal with the problem.
I'm just curious, there's much being made of women's involvement in 1916 and maybe forgotten contribution to nationalist movement at the time. Is it your argument though that quite the contrary, that most women in Ireland at the time, certainly urban women, would have been quite anti-Irish nationalism? Or
No, I think it was part of the developing idea of nationhood, that a lot of women were very, very active in the independence movement. There were women like Anna Haslam, but she was the exception who argued against it. But in the south, certainly it was different in the north, but in the south, no, I mean, women were fully committed. I think one of the amazing things is how many women who were very active in the suffrage campaign, like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, became completely committed to the struggle for independence. And then I think got into this cul-de-sac with the treaty debate. They opposed the treaty and they saw it as an attack on. I think the irony of it was that the proclamation of the Republic guaranteed equality, the democratic programme of the First Door guaranteed equality, and when they were defending the Republic, they saw themselves as defending those aspirational documents. The trouble is that in doing so, because the anti-treaty forces were defeated and the more radical elements in them were marginalised, a lot of the women attached themselves to those most radical elements and were also marginalised. So a lot of women who were councillors or TDs even in the first Dáil or second Dáil ended up in the wilderness as a result. And they were all sort of, it's a tragedy for a lot of them, but I think a lot of women like Margaret Buckley, Kathleen Lynn, Archbishop McQuaid built the Crumlin Hospital as part of the exercise of isolating and marginalising St. Aldans. he didn't want these women, particularly Protestant women, running hospitals. You know, they had to be dealt with, and so the new state marginalised them, and I don't think they realised the odds against them, the odds that they faced. But I do think they thought they were fighting for an Ireland would treat women equally with men, and they identified with the anti-treaty forces. What I suppose they didn't realise is that most of the men in the anti-treaty side were as bad, if you like, as the men in the pro-treaty side when it came to their attitude to women. It was a tragedy, a personal tragedy. A lot of those people lived very, very angry and very frustrated lives, you know.
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. One of your figures showed that Belfast at the time was a bigger city, bigger population than Dublin. When did it happen? When did Dublin take over? Did it take long after the...
It was, yeah. I haven't looked at. I find as I get older, again, my grasp on figures declines. But Belfast, I mean, exploded. I mean, it was about 20,000 at the beginning of the 19th century. By this period, it was up well over 400 thousand. Dublin's population was 299,000, the 1911 census, and then you add in the county. You're talking the guts of another 100,000, but lower than Belfast, much lower than Belfast and its environment and its environs. There were 92,000 odd Protestants in Dublin city and county, mainly the county as well. So they were the largest concentration outside of Belfast. But the key difference was Belfast was industrial. 27% of all adult males, and that's everyone over the age of 14 in Dublin, was an unskilled worker. Because unlike Britain and unlike Belfast, there was no industrial revolution here worth talking about. So the chance of enhanced skills, learning new skills, didn't arise. So that's why you had this huge unskilled block in the population. But Belfast was different, and Belfast had this sectarian division. Didn't happen here because there was very small Protestant working class in Dublin by that period. The Act of Union, ironically enough, decimated the Protestant working class. There was a very, very strong Orange presence in Dublin. In fact, some people argue you can trace the development of Orange lodges in Britain, picking around Liverpool, from the emigration of Protestant workers. They were skilled, so if their jobs dried up here because of competition under the Union, they could get work in Britain, in North America, or in what became known as the White Commonwealth. So they emigrated. It was middle class that was Protestant middle class that was big, not the Protestant working class. In fact, in the decade before, there's some figures stick in your mind and others don't. In the decade before the First World War, 1/3 of all Protestant working class brides in Dublin married British soldiers. And when the soldiers' regiment moved elsewhere, they moved with them. So there was even in that sense, the attachment to the empire was draining them away. But Belfast was much, much bigger than Dublin.
I was intrigued by the title of your lecture. One of the reasons I came to it had a lot of statistical information which I haven't absorbed, but the title is a conjugation of the crown and money, and conveniently not using the monetary crown, but the half crown. Are you familiar with the fact that this conjunction is still not uncommon in a certain part of Ireland?
No, yeah.
My wife is from the northeastern part of Ireland, from the nationalist tradition. And I've heard her parents and others of that generation, they're not mostly gone now. But there's a certain criticism, particularly 20, 30 years ago, of the allegiance of Orangemen and the general unionists to the crown. The dig was actually their true allegiance is to the half crown.
Sure.
So the conjunction of crown and half crown, that conjunction did not inform the title of your lecture.
No.
But I have heard that conjunction myself as recently as 20 or 30 years ago in the northeast of Ireland as a criticism by nationalists of the unionist tradition, which was actually more enticed for union by the half crown than the crown.
Absolutely.
So that wasn't the purpose of
No, it was related, it's very local, it's very parochial. But funny enough, when my dad joined the British Army, he used to say he joined the British Army to see the world, and they sent him to Omer. And he spent nearly a year in Omer before eventually he ended up being shipped overseas. But he was in Omer. So the very first time he did his basic training there, he was given a loaded rifle with the possibility of having to use it, was in Omer, and it was acting in aid of the civil power, in other words, the RUC, on 17th of March 1941. And the second time was at Easter 1941, and the third time was in July the 12th, 1941, when they were on the streets in support of the aid of the civil power, in order to make sure that nobody, instead of nationalists having a demonstration, nobody tried to interfere with the Orange Orders march, although I think they actually had a rally indoors because there was a ban on outdoor processions. But he said there were quite a lot of men in his unit who were from the south, and they were quite bemused by this situation. He had all these unionists marching behind these banners into this hall, proclaiming their undying loyalty to king and country, and none of them were in uniform. But they were there to defend. They were there to defend.
But it was
Yeah.
a good put down.
Oh, it was. Yes. Yeah.
To say
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. But my dad was also.
Allegiance is to the half.
My dad was also a servant of the half crown, but he was having to serve the crown in slightly different ways to them. But yeah, no. One of the chairman of the Irish Times when I worked there many years ago was Major McDougall, and funnily enough, he was in the same place my dad was in the British Army, and he spent the entire war defending Northern Ireland from the IRA and the Wehrmacht. He never served overseas. A lot of Northern Ireland people joined up the local defence, but their war they would mobilise to defend Northern Ireland, not to defend anything else. I'm not saying the Irish government of course was neutral, but you know, these complexities exist. Most of the troops, most of the men who fought in Dublin on the British side in 1916 were Irish, because where do you get troops from to put down a rebellion? You go to the nearest barracks you have, the Curragh and Belfast. And in fact, the UVF, who hadn't gone to fight, most of them, took over patrol duties in Belfast to allow the regiments there to go south. And interestingly enough, if you look at some of the accounts of prisoners taken, rebel prisoners taken in 1916, who were held in the Custom House, which was under the control for a while of the Royal Irish Rifles, I think. There were lots of, they weren't fed, they weren't given water, some of them were beaten, and their treatment improved when British members of English regiments took over the duty. So, you know, sometimes your enemy's enemy is not always your friend. So, I mean, there are these complexities there. I reckon if it wasn't for Mount Street Bridge, probably most of the casualties on both sides would have been Irish, certainly if you had in the RIC.
Take any final questions? Okay, well, I'd just like to say thank you very much.
Oh, thank
Gordon.
you.
It was a great
Thanks.
talk,
Yes.
and I hope you enjoy the rest of Easter celebrations over the weekend, and we hope to see you again soon. Okay, thank you.